Hey, good evening, everybody. Welcome to those both that are here in person and also joining us via live stream. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event, which is focused on AI governance for humanity. My name is David Holtz. I'm an assistant professor in the management of organizations and entrepreneurship and innovation groups here at UC Berkeley Haas. We're honored to host this important discussion, and it's wonderful to see such a great audience joining us here this evening. We're living through a period of time that's simultaneously both very exciting and also concerning in terms of both the volume and types of advances that are happening in artificial intelligence. To briefly speak about some of my own work, some of my recent research has highlighted both the potential promise and potential perils of artificial intelligence. So in a paper that was released this past December, my co-authors and I report the results from a field experiment with over 600 small business owners in Kenya. In this field experiment, we randomized access to a WhatsApp-based LLM-powered AI mentor and measured its impact on business performance. Overall, we don't find a statistically significant effect of the AI mentor on business performance. However, we do find statistically significant and economically meaningful effects when we looked at different subpopulations in the experiment. So more specifically, we found that access to the AI mentor improved business performance for those businesses that were already successful, but negatively impacted business performance for those businesses that were less successful. I think these results underscore the dual nature of AI in this moment, its potential to transform lives in a positive manner, but also the potential to exacerbate existing disparities. The question of how we govern and regulate AI is critical. It involves considerations not only of how we deploy AI tools, but also of how we develop those tools. In this context, the UN has taken a proactive step. Dr. Amandeep Gill, as the UN Secretary General's Technology Envoy, leads a distinguished team within the high-level advisory body on AI, which was established by the UN Secretary General in October of last year. Comprising 39 experts, this body is crafting key recommendations to guide AI governance. Their interim report, Governing AI for Humanity, outlines several strategic functions of AI governance, aiming to maximize benefits while minimizing risks. These insights will contribute to the forthcoming discussions at the UN Summit of the Future, which is happening later this year. This evening, we're privileged to hear from Dr. Gill about the advisory body's interim findings. Outside of his work as the UN Secretary General's Envoy on Technology, Dr. Gill is the Chief Executive Officer of the International Digital Health and Artificial Intelligence Research Collaborative Project, which is based at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. He has a long list of accolades, which in the interest of time, I will not go through, but you can take my word that he is an incredibly accomplished individual, and we're so excited to have him here this evening. Following Dr. Gill's presentation, a panel of experts from across UC Berkeley and the broader Bay Area will engage in a discussion regarding these developments. We'll then invite questions from the audience, which will provide a platform for broader dialogue. Thank you again for everyone's presence and engagement. And without further delay, I am honored to introduce Dr. Amandeep Gill.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here at UC Berkeley and speak about the UN's work on the governance of artificial intelligence. My colleague Lucy and I have been here this week to meet with academia, so of course Berkeley, Stanford, to meet with the private sector. Not only the big companies that you see in the headlines developing large language models, but also the startups doing incredibly interesting stuff. And this tour is part of a listening and engagement phase that the advisory body on AI is engaged in prior to its final meeting in Singapore in the summer. And I will show you some slides about the work of the advisory body. But I do want to start by clarifying what we mean when we talk about governance as opposed to regulation, and what do we mean by the international governance of AI? Because there shouldn't be any confusion about roles of different institutions before we start to get into concepts, ideas, and proposals. Now, firstly, I think governance is a larger concept. Regulation is a subset of that. Regulation is often about addressing harms and risks, about the interface between users and technology. Governance is a broader concept, and that could also mean catalyzing opportunity, preventing what is called misuse. And you have perhaps in some geographies more fear and anxiety about AI, but in other geographies you have more of excitement that this technology will help us leapfrog some challenges. So you see a lot of that in Asia, also in Africa, less so in Latin America. So the views around AI on risks and opportunities are diverse. So the notion of governance is larger than that of regulation. And it's also about not just governing the technology, but it's about some of the institutional weaknesses we see in areas that are relevant to the impact of AI. So just to give you an example, we cannot talk about deep fakes, misinformation, disinformation, and what AI will do in that space without thinking about the strength of our existing institutions, public interest media, literacy about technology in the general population. So in a sense, as we move further into the AI age, we need to build resilience, societal resilience, institutional resilience, and that's part of the governance problem. So I just wanted to spend some time to make sure that, and then international governance. So there is a layered approach to governance when it comes to these powerful technologies. The big chunk is national governance, national jurisdictions, national regulatory measures. They play an important role there. The EU AI Act, the US Executive Order, the Chinese interim measures on generative AI. And then you have a significant layer of industry self-regulation, codes of conduct, self-regulatory measures of other kinds, the initiatives like Partnership on AI or the Frontier Models Forum. And then there is a very significant layer, thin layer, but significant, of international governance. And that's what I'm going to address today. And to help us think about what are the critical functions that need to be performed at this international layer of governance, what are the kind of opportunities and enablers, because the opportunities don't flow automatically, we should be thinking about what are the risks and challenges, because it's not only the risks, but also some of the kind of challenges that come in the way of our handling of those risks that we need to be thinking about. So to help the international community grapple with these issues, the Secretary General set up this group last year. And it comes at a moment when there is a high degree of interest in this issue. You've heard of the Bletchley Park UK AI Safety Summit. There's going to be a follow-on summit in Korea, then in France early next year. So in this proliferation of efforts, we need to have some coordination, so some kind of coherence, so that we don't create more fragmentation in terms of how we handle technologies. And importantly, we need to ensure that everyone is at the table. So if AI matters for all of humanity and all its advocates say, oh, this is going to change the world, then the entire world has to be involved in that conversation. So no taxation without representation, as we hear in this country. So if you say AI is good for me or is bad for me, then I should be at the table. And if we have conversations that are limited to groups of 7, 10, 20 countries, then it's not about humanity. So that's why the UN's role, 193 member states, becomes important. And also the way it is done is important. It has to be a multi-stakeholder conversation. Government, civil society, academia, tech community, and the private sector have to come together. This is a snapshot of the 39 members coming from all 5 regions of the world, gender balanced in terms of different stakeholder groups, areas of expertise, from Father Paolo Benanti, who helps the Vatican, leads the Vatican's policy on AI governance, to James Nonnecke, who is president at Google, AI and society. So we have a diverse range of experts from different fields thinking about this issue for the UN. And in December, they released an interim report. And I'll just highlight some features, the deficit in governance, and what kind of risks they see. I mean, they didn't draw up a huge list of risks because that's never ending. It's going down a rabbit hole. But they looked at risks from the perspective of vulnerability, of people, of communities, of the planet. And then they looked at the opportunities for the Sustainable Development Goals, but what is actually required to seize those opportunities? Because 5-7 companies are not going to move the needle. And productivity is not going to flow down. I mean, gains in productivity, we still have to see them, are not going to flow down automatically to the entire world. So you need an effort. You need access to data, compute, talent, and you need frameworks for collaboration to realize those opportunities. And then there has been a lot of debate about what kind of an international institution we should have for the governance of AI. A lot of people think of the nuclear analogy, and the movie Oppenheimer, helped us think about powerful technologies and how we manage them or not manage them very well. So people said, we need an International Atomic Energy Agency for AI, because there are significant differences between nuclear technologies and AI. And so the easy analogies are not helpful. So we need to think about what are the functions we need to perform, and what are the guiding principles for this architectural work. So it's a step at a time. So what the body did in December was come up with some architectural guidance. So this was in the end of last year. And now the body is actually engaged in moving from those functions to forms. And recently it has spoken about some critical forms, some foundational pieces that we should put down before not too late. And I'll come back to that in a second. So we are actually in the phase of consultations on those functions, those forms. And not only the body is talking to governments, but other experts. It has a large consultative network of 200 plus experts. So almost like a peer review group. And to kind of critically assess its work, its recommendation, give it feedback, and then we are moving into Singapore before finalizing the report. And the timing is significant because this is just before the Summit of the Future. AI governance needs to be anchored in a larger frame of technology governance, and the Summit of the Future. One of the key outcomes there is a global digital compact. So if we can agree on some sensible suggestions, some foundational elements, as I put them, they can be embedded into the global digital compact and endorsed by leaders at that summit. So action can follow the analysis rather than, another report just stacked up on the shelf. Nice read, great ideas, but then where is the follow-up? So we have a unique opportunity here. Then what are those ideas? So the body has looked at some critical, let's call it the irreducible minimum set of functions that you need at the international level, from a regular horizon scanning, science-based assessments of what's the technology like, what are its implications, all the way to compliance and accountability with agreed norms. Now, the horizon scanning is a no-brainer because today you have a lot of uncertainty and a lot of information asymmetries about what the tech is. Even teams that are developing large language models are not sure how some things work and not sure of the implications. Ministers, CEOs, board members that I've spoken with, they're struggling with this. And we can't make good policy in the dark. So we have to switch on the lights and do it on the basis of facts and scientific evidence. For this, we need a set of independent experts, just like the advisory body, to come together regularly and issue reports. Analogies, be careful there, they can mislead. But one example I can give you is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has helped establish the fact that we are doing something to the climate. It's still not 100% accepted, but it's largely, it's accepted because of that scientific work. And then there is need, as I said, this fragmentation, to avoid that fragmentation, to have interoperability, to have opportunities to learn from each other, to come together. The UK AI Safety Institute, US AI Safety Institute, if everyone sits down and does their own thing, and we have no way to engage each other, except perhaps bilaterally or in small groups, then the wider world misses out on the lessons of that critical work. And then there is work around standards, safety and risk management frameworks. What are the technical standards? How do we mediate standards across different jurisdictions? And then so on in moving up to the facilitation side. I mentioned the misuse risk. So how do we avoid that? By facilitating the development of AI in the global south in particular, facilitating model training and testing, and encouraging, catalyzing international collaboration on data, compute, and talent. The world has seen some big science efforts. Think CERN, the ITER project, the International Thermonuclear Energy Research Project, the Square Kilometre Array in South Africa. So something similar might be needed to move the needle on the SDGs, because the private sector may not have the market-based incentives to do some things around climate change, plastics in the oceans, etc. So where you would need those kind of international collaborative efforts. So those are the kind of functions that the body has suggested. And then moving from function to form, this is the 5 critical minimum recommendations that they have made to the negotiators of the Global Digital Compact. Establish an international scientific panel on AI, constitute a regular dialogue on AI governance across the significant jurisdictions, establish a global forum for the harmonization of AI standards to avoid duplication of standards development, to deconflict some of the work, and move from generally a more tech-heavy approach to a socio-technical approach to standards, because we need that paradigm shift with AI, which is not just, it's essentially the interface of the analog and the digital world where AI is most powerful. So we need a new paradigm of standards. And then capacity building and benefit sharing on AI, especially with the Global South. Just to give you an example, because often in the US, it's hard to understand, what is it that we're talking about? This is not the digital divide of old, 2.7 billion people not connected to the internet. It's not even the digital divide of not having affordable, meaningful access. If you are accessing the internet just on a small device, it's very, like many kids did in the Global South during the COVID pandemic, it's very different from having a laptop and having, the access to resources that you can use to educate yourself in a different way, rather than just being a consumer of. So we have those kind of divides, but there's a looming AI divide. And of the 30-odd supercomputers, the 100 top supercomputers in the world are concentrated in 30-odd countries. And 160-odd countries have no way to train large models. Of the top 50 countries in AI, there's none from Africa. So those are the kind of asymmetries we're talking about. So the body is suggesting there should be a partnership, and then there should be a global fund to catalyze that kind of international scientific effort on AI for sustainable development. I'm getting to the end of my presentation. Just to reiterate that there is this unique opportunity at the Summit of the Future to reboot multilateralism. We are at a very difficult juncture in international relations, conflicts. There is geopolitical competition, but there are some problems that don't have passports. There are some challenges that we can't handle in a single country or in a group of countries. So you need to have conversation with, sometimes difficult conversation with the non-like-minded. So this summit is about some of those futures. One of those is the governance of technology, particularly emerging technologies like AI. And we are very hopeful that we can get together and lay down some foundational pieces that allow us to build an open, free, secure, empowering, and inclusive digital future. So thank you very much for your patience and for listening to me, and I look forward to the discussion.
All right, thank you, Dr. Gill. In terms of format, we'll now invite all of our panelists up to join Dr. Gill on stage. I realized during Dr. Gill's remarks that there is not a seat for the moderator, so I will just stand over here at this this podium for the duration of the event. In terms of format, each of our panelists will spend a few moments reacting to the report and Dr. Gill's remarks, after which we'll sort of engage in more of an open dialogue between everyone that's up here. And then to end the event, we will open it up to questions from the audience. So it is my pleasure to introduce our first esteemed panelist, David Harris, who's a Chancellor's Public Scholar here at UC Berkeley, is on the professional faculty here at the Haas School of Business, is a Senior Research Fellow at the International Computer Science Institute, a Senior Fellow at the Center for International Governance and Innovation, and a Senior Policy Advisor at the California Initiative for Technology and Democracy. David.
Thanks so much. So how long do I have? I've got
5 minutes or so.
All right. Well, this is so thrilling to be here with all of you and sitting next to you. Amandeep, I've been studying your work and your panel and what you've been doing for a lot of the past year and watching your speeches and wondering when I would someday get the opportunity to sit near you on a stage. There is, I think, an urgent need to regulate AI in a binding way. That's, I think, my biggest message. I think we are seeing right now a race to the bottom on caution and safety in the development of AI systems. It's not new. It started before ChatGPT. It's something that I've been thinking about and teaching about for quite some time here at the business school. And I think many of the first initial sets of harms that we saw were about AI bias, about discrimination, about racism. My former employer, Facebook, actually was sued by the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development for facilitating housing discrimination in advertising. And that's that happened under existing laws. That happened under what I consider to be the most important AI law in the United States. Anyone know which one that is? Most important AI law in the United States? The 1964 Civil Rights Act. I think that's actually the most important one, because that allows the federal government or for anyone to sue for discrimination under a number of different categories, protected classes, and I think that's exciting, and we have laws for that. That is something that we can pursue. But with other types of AI harms, such as harms caused by disinformation. Not a totally new phenomenon, but I would argue something that is dramatically facilitated by generative AI technologies. We don't have very many good laws to address that. And in some ways, we have laws that make it even harder for us to address that in the United States than they do in Europe and in other parts of the world. And I'm thinking about Section 230 and the First Amendment, which have great, important roles, but need to be, I think, considered, maybe reconsidered in certain ways in light of the developments with AI. My other really big area of concern that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about lately is harms to children, harms in particular to women who are victims of AI-generated non-consensual intimate imagery and child sexual abuse material. Unfortunately, there have been AI models, many AI models now, that were trained, perhaps by accident, on large quantities of images of child sexual abuse. One of those models is called Stable Diffusion 1.5, comes from a startup that received investment from many of Silicon Valley's big investors. And it was trained on thousands of images of CSAM. Some great researchers over at Stanford. You got to say something good about Stanford sometimes. They found that, and then the data set was taken down, but Stable Diffusion 1.5 has been downloaded 4 million times in the past month from Hugging Face. Why is it legal to have a model that's trained on child sexual abuse material, and by extension, we can assume can produce child sexual abuse material? Why do we still have that on the internet? Why do we have dozens of undressing apps that will take a face or an image of a person and create non-consensual pornography of that person for you? Why do these apps mostly not work on men?
Yes, exactly.
Yes, it's mostly women. I agree. That's absolutely the case. They mostly just work on women, and I think that's probably a civil rights violation. If some lawyer can tell me how to make that case, and I think that female politicians will likely be victims of that in very disproportionate ways compared to men. So it's those kinds of abuses, those kinds of harms. Right now, we're seeing play out not just in those spaces that I've already talked about. We're seeing them play out in high schools and even in middle schools in California, in New Jersey, all over the world. And I think a lot about what could be done about these things, and I can't think of a way to deal with them without new laws. That's where I'll leave it.
All right. Thank you, David. Our next panelist is Nilou Salehi, who's an assistant professor at the School of Information here at UC Berkeley.
Thank you so much. Echoing a lot of that, I wanted to start with a provocation. And my provocation is going to be that in this response, I'm only going to use the word AI once, and that was it. And my point in doing that is that I really want us to take a moment to decenter the actual technology that we're talking about here and really think about the people, the organization, the politics. I completely agree that these harms are massive and really important and really, really hurting people, but they're also not new. None of these harms are new. Women have been subjugated to these types of harms since before there was an AI that could do it. I've also, in my research, in my lab, we've looked a lot at different types of harms, like in hiring. We have all sorts of systems that are automating parts of it now. But like you said, the Civil Rights Act has actually existed for a long time. And I've actually started looking at what would it look like if we started framing these challenges as sort of, how do we look at where the harms are, presuming that most of them are not new? And what is the precedent that we've had so far and how we've dealt with them, the laws and regulations? So, for instance, if you think of hiring, we have a range of laws. We have anti-discrimination laws from the Civil Rights Act. We also have fair labor laws. We have laws around equal pay, genetic information non-discrimination, family and medical leave. And so you could take any of these and see how did new technologies exacerbate these harms, or how do these existing laws apply to new technologies, and do we need new types of laws, or do we need extensions on these laws? The other case that me and my lab have looked at in our research is actually new technologies used in the criminal legal system. And there are a lot of them, and it's increasing, and we're exceedingly going towards more data and technology in the courtroom over things like eyewitnesses. And there's a lot of existing laws there too. So we have laws of evidence and fair trial. We have laws of admissibility, reliability, exclusion of illegally obtained evidence. Expert testimony has a lot of laws. And when you actually look at how new technologies get standardized and actually how these laws already apply to them, it's really, really bad. You can take any of these technologies that are routinely used in the courtroom and start to dig into the standardization and the evaluations that have been run on them and how it actually goes with or against existing laws, and we're already in trouble. So I think that's a good starting point to start thinking about the people, the practices, and our existing institutions. The other last thing that I wanted to mention is in my lab, I've done a lot of work on restorative justice as an approach to thinking about harm. And I completely agree with you. I think it's really good to think about laws as dealing with harm and governance as being something broader. But if we just focus on the harm for a second, what restorative justice teaches is to really focus on the people who are harmed, ask who is harmed, what are their needs, and whose obligation is it to meet those needs. And I think those three simple questions actually take us very far in thinking about what are the various spaces that new technologies are emerging, who are they hurting, who are the relevant actors, and sometimes it's the state, sometimes it might be international law, sometimes it might be companies, and then what are the obligations of those companies. So within restorative justice, we know that obligations can be things like prevention of future harm. They can be things like information. A lot of the times people don't know that they are harmed or how they are harmed or need help in sense making around that harm. So there are all these various obligations that we can start thinking of. And I think the whole point of what I was trying to say is if we take the people, really focus on where the harm is happening and go from there towards how are new technologies changing that, we get much, much, much further than if we start with sort of, here's this new technology, now what do we do with it? I think we get more teeth and more action if we start from the people. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Nilou. Our next panelist is Brandie Nonnecke, who is the director at the Citrus Policy Lab, an associate research professor here at the Goldman School of Public Policy, and also the host of Tech Hype.
Great. Thank you so much. So, yes, I'm the host of Tech Hype, and I'm going to do a little drop on that because I want you all to check it out. So, Tech Hype is a show where we debunk misunderstandings around emerging technologies, debate the real benefits and risks, and explore technical and policy interventions. We also offer TLDRs. You all know that. Too long didn't read, because you're not reading everything, where I analyze and summarize the tech policies that matter. First, I want to riff on your provocation of, are we actually in a new place? And I would say, no, we're not at all. We are we are not in a new place. This is our, fourth industrial revolution? Right? I think, probably. Yes. And then also, if we think back about history, those who had the means, those who had power, they controlled the narrative. If we think about the history, even of the United States, Christopher Columbus discovered America. No, he did not discover America. There were people here before. So one thing I think that's really important for us to discuss is that artificial intelligence and these tools used in our society are not causing discrimination. Quite the opposite. They're revealing it. They're showing it with data that it exists. And now that it exists and we can see it, we can address it. So I actually think that's one of the benefits of AI. Next, on coordination of our strategies, how might we think about governing this new technology? You talked a lot about, and David, you too, about established law. In the United States, we mostly take ex post approach, where we establish laws that give people standing to sue if something goes wrong. Now, the EU approach is an ex ante approach, where they try to mitigate harm before it happens. We're seeing that the US is trying to move more toward this ex ante approach of mitigating harms of these AI tools before they enter the market, much like we did for very high risk sectors like the automobile industry, tobacco, other really harmful things. Whether or not we're going to see the United States adopt any legislation that is similar to the EU, I would not necessarily hold my breath. We're a very litigious society, and artificial intelligence spans across every sector. But there are some advancements in California that I would like to talk about when we get into our discussion. The next thing, my next point, is what I call the shiny toy distraction. All of us started, well, not all of us on this panel, because we've been working in AI or AI governance for at least the past 10 years. And now all of a sudden, ChatGPT started to pop up, and people thought, wow, this is a pretty impressive tool. And I'm scared. And we are seeing governments becoming hyper-focused on generative AI tools, while at the same time, less advanced forms of machine learning are surreptitiously making decisions that affect each and every one of you in this room, in your ability to exercise your rights. In California, we have an executive order specifically focused on Gen AI. Governor Inslee of the state of Washington also issued a very similar executive order. And I'm very concerned that if we are hyper-focused on this shiny new toy, that we are going to be distracted from implementing appropriate safeguards for other forms of machine learning. Now, last, and back to my first point about cutting through the hype, AI is incredibly hyped. It is portrayed as both dystopian, of headlines of robots replacing workers and the death of creativity, to utopian, right? That AI will finally allow us to solve climate change. Everybody and their rights will be upheld. But it's much more nuanced than that. And so what we do at our show, Tech Hype, is we try to cut through that to have a more balanced discussion so that we can actually identify real technical and policy strategies that will allow us to harness every type of AI for good.
All right. Thank you, Brandie. Our next panelist is Mark Nitzberg, who's the Executive Director of Berkeley's Center for Human Compatible AI and the Director of Technology Research of BRI. Mark.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I would say, the technical one here on the panel. And I'd just like to take my 5 minutes and talk about the actual technology and maybe why it's actually different, why we might, I'm going to mention AI more than once, although we could just say advanced computing. There is in the first 50 some years of pursuit in advanced computing, that was sometimes called AI, a real connection to engineering, where you build something that is meant to achieve a particular objective, and it's a series of well-defined steps. And so if you think of something like the apps that you use, maybe Microsoft Word, there's a million lines of code, and they're all meant to do very specific things. And what is new with AI, and this is the last decade or so, is that it's not designed in that sense. The behavior of the system is not determined by so much by the programmer as by the data, and this is hugely amplified when we moved from initially it was vision and voice transcription, and then ultimately language. And when we moved to language, we needed vast amounts of data, and so these systems are they're really different from any engineered system. And I just want to impress upon you that in itself makes them very hard to when there is a behavior that causes harm, very, very hard to regulate, and if you can't trace a failure to its source and then correct it, you really have, I think, the possibility for a great deal of harm, right? Then, so we don't understand, and in fact, that the designers of the system at Microsoft don't understand whether these systems have objectives that are sort of built in. They're trained on text, and the people who wrote the text probably had objectives, and so there could be these implicit objectives that you evoke when you use a system like this. But I think that this is what really makes it unique, right? The systems are more like they're grown rather than being designed. I'm just looking to see if I have anything to say that hasn't already been said beyond that. So I appreciated the interim report, and as I was reading over it, the one thing that I noticed was not mentioned, and that I think is probably worth bringing up is the issue of displacement of certain tasks, not necessarily job-killing technology, but just the way tasks move, and often people end up economically worse off, and ways to mitigate that. And I think that that may be worth bearing. And then if you want to see, just what kinds of jobs might be in the crosshairs of some of these things, you could look at the Microsoft or Amazon websites and read up on the retrieval augmented generation, which I think is something that you'll see a lot more. This is a way of tethering the language model outputs to actual specific sources. Anyway, I will leave it with that. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you, Mark. And finally, our last panelist, I'd like to introduce Henriette Cramer, who's the co-founder of Papermoon AI and is the former head of algorithmic impact at Spotify. So introducing Henriette.
Is it okay if I make a tiny little interception? Please. Sorry. I'm absolutely certain that you didn't mean it this way, but I did want to, especially for the students in the room, mention that if you do center people, it doesn't necessarily make you any less technical. I don't think that these go against each other necessarily. I have a PhD in computer science from Stanford. I worked at Microsoft on AI models back in 2015 when they could barely summarize a sentence. And I think that we do need, of course, a lot of technical work to go into that. I think sometimes what happens, and again, I'm sure you didn't mean it this way, but this is in the air. It's sort of like you're either technical and you can build things, or you are in the business of thinking about people. And I think that that is not helpful. So sorry, and I didn't mean to take away from your time.
Hi, everyone. I'm Henriette Cramer, co-founder of Papermoon, like Dave said, and previously at Spotify. I basically try to go, okay, how can I take those methods from research to avoid harms in search and recommendations into practical ways of working with whole bunches of product areas, and how do you do things like policy or algorithmic impact assessments? And what you just said about like being technical, it's been really interesting moving from a position where I was working on research teams and in product teams where I was always like that human HCI, human computer interaction person, moving into a trust and safety policy space where all of a sudden I was like, oh, that's that data and technical person. Go, wow, that's interesting how that's perceived and that gap between communities. So there's a couple of things that during that work, and also other work in, for example, at Yahoo, worked on things like how to avoid really low quality and terrible ads that you don't want to see, and previously did a PhD in trust in AI before that really was a theme. A couple of things that stand out, and especially listening to your presentation and all of your points. So the first is really incentives. How can we, using, for example, these types of efforts that are really important, create incentives to do this type of work? So at a company, sometimes when doing the rational thing, there may not necessarily be the incentive to fully invest in, let's do a 6-month deep dive in this obscure error case that we see. But similarly, in academia, and again, I come from academia before I moved into industry, there may not necessarily be the incentive beyond, I created a wonderful new method to assess AI. Here's the paper. Good luck. But it's a really cool method, right? But how are folks working on this in practice actually supposed to keep up with all of that work? And then we have another incentive that everyone now needs to go way, way faster. And everyone needs to produce more and more and more and more. So things that were really difficult for us to build 4 years ago are much easier now. And yes, we're democratizing access, but that also means that people can generate demos that do really interesting things and put them online without any types of ways of how do we actually evaluate how this works? What impact does this have? So one thing there is also, for me, really important with can we invest and create incentives to actually go, how do you evaluate whether this is high quality? How do you evaluate whether this is safe? What are the methods? Can we actually do, like we're always very hopeful with data-informed policy. Okay, but if you don't have the methods, then you're not going to do that. So we need those types of efforts, and those may be very long-term and at very different scales than you may be able to do at either one institute or one company. So that does bring me also to things like community gaps. I really love these types of conversations because we're actually getting together. We actually like met even at the same institute. Not everyone knew each other. But those gaps in some cases are really, really growing, especially if we're making really big statements about like, oh, companies do this, or academia and governments do not understand. Those gaps are really, really growing. And then we have a lot of people who are now building their own demos, doing really cool stuff, but then go, oh man, all those discussions about responsibility, so like slows us down. You need to pull all those people into the conversation. You can't make it this completely separate thing. So how do you actually have those conversations? And that also means, again, that we can't have this giant overload of everyone just producing in their own community, like really cool, fancy statements about how we were more responsible that no one has time to do. So we made all these technologies to get rid of information overload, and now it's actually creating some of the information overload. So I would love to see more efforts on how to make those community gaps like smaller, how to pull in people even when we're like, oh, really? I have to have this conversation? Yes, you have to have these conversations. And one thing that was really nice for me to hear as well, like, yes, governance is not just the legal side. Because as someone who was really excited that there were more laws coming, something I should have probably thought about a little bit earlier was, oh, wait, if it's not necessarily in that legal context, do people still get to work on it? Or is it like, oh yeah, sorry, that's not on the list, so it's not so important anymore? And really thinking through how we create the incentives to also have those things that are not about compliance included is super, super important to me. And then I'll come up with way more opinions while we'll talk through all the other questions.
All right, amazing. Thank you, Henriette. So now we'll talk about some topics that I have listed here. Feel free to, I guess, just indicate if you want the mic. I think I'll start with a question that is related to something that Mark said over email, actually also related to something that Amandeep said during his remarks. So Mark drew parallels between AI and regulated industries that we're all familiar with, things like aviation and nuclear power. Amandeep mentioned Oppenheimer. So what types of regulatory frameworks do people think could be adopted from these fields to ensure the safe and ethical use of AI? And are there ways in which the regulatory frameworks that we're familiar with in these contexts actually don't necessarily so easily port over to this different type of technology? So that's one question I would pose to the panel. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think very specifically, the civil aviation industry, there is an aspect of implementation of norms that's of relevance. So you have these treaties that on civil aviation safety, on interoperability, baggage tracing happens, but different jurisdictions implement them in their own ways. So it's distributed implementation. So there is no like civil aviation inspectors that go down and enforce the law. That is left to national jurisdictions. But I think that's a good lesson from that domain. From the nuclear industry, a good lesson is that industry, if you look at the cost of a nuclear power plant, then a lot of that is attributable to safety and regulatory measures. So the fuel itself, some of the other stuff, that is relatively smaller. Now, so far, the AI industry has not been costing those things, has not been doing the rest of the stuff. So it has to, as it looks to the future, as investors look at investing in AI, they have to start thinking about there will be need for regulation, there will be need for life cycle approaches in terms of liability, in terms of harm, and redressal, etc. So they need to start thinking about costing that as well. The final thing I want to say, reacting to, this, I'm a little uncomfortable with thinking of this as another industrial revolution, because that kind of, gives us this kind of mindset that, there was a first one, then second one, then third one, then fourth one. We are in some kind of an historic progression. I think there are discontinuities here in terms of the historical development. And what you were saying about the nature of this technology, I think as a technologies that's moved on to the social science side, so I'm a hybrid, I think we have to, almost like when you make pasta, you have ingredients and a recipe. So that is your data and your software. And then you get an output. Here we are reversing this. The output comes in place of the software, and the software is generated. So there are these kind of issues with, data-driven behavior. And the data is a reflection, as Niloufer, you said, of all that's wrong or right with our world. So we are getting pulled into things that are kind of, different from what we've seen before. So I think that's the history lesson, if you will.
David?
So one that you mentioned earlier was the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I think we do need that for AI, but actually I think climate change is the perfect example of what AI regulation really, really cannot become. Otherwise, we're really screwed. Because, I actually met the chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 25 years ago, Bob Watson. I was a student activist. I was a student here at Berkeley, and I went to COP6, and I went and did street theater. I just dressed up in a George Bush mask and held up an American flag with the stars replaced with corporate logo icons. And, I was so passionate about climate change, and just decades, like if you look at 92 Rio Earth Summit, then you look at Kyoto, and then we eventually got to Paris Accord, but it took so long, and it wasn't enough. It's still not nearly enough. And if we do that with AI, we're in really big trouble. And so I think we need to have standards that are much higher about legally binding governance at the international level of AI if we want to have any hope of succeeding. So I'd put climate as a don't do it like that.
All right. I want to tell a little story. So about 4 years ago, me and my students were working on machine translation models like Google Translate and how to make them more reliable. And we came across this paper that a colleague had written at UCSF Hospital, where she's both an emergency room doctor and a researcher. And she had basically taken discharge instructions from the hospital, ran them through Google Translate, translated from English to Chinese, and found that there was about a 20% error rate, with 8% of those errors causing clinically significant harm. So I was really, really surprised by this. I was surprised that it even was used in a hospital setting, because that sounded really weird to me. I was also working with the Google team a little bit, and the Google Translate people had no idea that it was being used in hospitals. So I reached out to this colleague, and we had a Zoom call, and I asked her about the research and then what she does, and she was explaining that, oh yeah, I use Google Translate all the time. I take my discharge instructions, put them through Google Translate, copy paste them back if the patient doesn't speak English, and add a little disclaimer that this was generated with Google Translate. And I was so shocked. I was like, you're the person who wrote the paper that said that this has such a high error rate. How are you doing this? And she also looked shocked back at me. I think this was a difference between a computer scientist and how we think and a medical doctor. And she said, everything we do in the hospital has an error rate. And I sort of have to think about the alternative for the patient and will they get this information or not? And that has just stuck with me, that conversation, and thinking a lot about, as we're thinking about what frameworks have existed and have worked, I think the ways that we regulate medical tools, diagnostic tools, and drugs could be a way to think about this. And the thing that they do really, really well and have established frameworks for is evaluation. So you can't just give someone a drug. It has to go through a clinical trial. They usually last over months and months. They're done across multiple different hospital settings. They're done across people of different races and genders. There's established guidelines for it. And then out of those evaluations, we have guidelines coming from regulatory bodies on how to use this and when not to use it. And I think that that's, again, thinking about what are the use cases, I think at least for some of the use cases, I think that that could be a really good model that we could think more about what would it actually look like for more of the models that we're using, especially in higher stakes settings, to go through these rigorous evaluations. I will add to that we are terrible at evaluation of AI models right now. I think we're in the very, very early days of it, and we need a ton more work on that.
Okay, I'm going to add on this. I do think that we're in an industrial revolution, and the next one is going to be at the intersection of quantum computing and machine learning and AI. Cryptography will be obsolete in the way that we view it now. And we're going to go through another change. And there's going to be so much more hype around the next wave of quantum machine learning. Your point about the fact that individuals have been harmed by predictive analytics for decades. I'm going to say something very provocative, and I know I'm being recorded, but the fact that generative AI tools are coming at white-collar jobs, that has caused people in positions of power to actually start to pay attention. We've been working on this for a very long time. Vulnerable populations are more often, especially if they use public services, to have data collected on them and models placed on that data that determine their livelihoods. And now all of a sudden, now we're concerned. And I really think it is because of that people are, white collar jobs are being affected. With that, we have 15 minutes. I want to get to more of the other questions. Unless you want to riff on this.
I'll have one added point to your evaluation and protocols. So for certain situations, turns out there's really interesting work and examples already going on. For example, yesterday I was here at Berkeley attending a panel that was about the usage of AI and analytics in basically tracking war crimes. And it turns out, and I learned about this by attending this panel, there is a Berkeley protocol for how to actually do this in a reliable way so the information can actually be used. So for these very specific, exactly, in court. Thank you. So having those very specific situations going, is this additive or is this taking something away? If we take this tech and this is how you do it and this is how you can follow it, having that available, that protocol, this is how you follow that. That is so, so important and very pragmatic thinking with, yes, we're actually getting it done and in this way, and we know what it does because we follow that protocol.
Great. In the interest of time, I have two questions I want to try to get through. Let's see if we can do it. The first one is a bit open-ended, but one thing that's notable, I think, about the interim report, and this has come up in the conversation we've had this far as well, is that the conversation is not just about democratizing access to AI and AI-based tools. It's also about democratizing access to the data, compute, and talent that's needed to develop these tools and develop these models. And I think that there are unique challenges associated with democratizing different aspects of AI, like the impacts, the access, the development, even the development of the data sets that the models are trained on. And so I'm curious if folks on the panel or Amandeep, if you have thoughts on, how we should think about these different dimensions and sort of the unique challenges and opportunities that exist in these sort of different aspects of the broader, sort of AI question.
I think this distinction is crucial and critical, and the way you've described is very eloquent. This will need resources and it'll need effort. Data, for example, what we have today is large language models based on internet scale data, just scraped off the net. But for the more powerful, narrow AI, you would need curated data sets. You would need gold standard flagship data sets, whether it's climate change resilient agriculture or certain health use cases. And they will have to be built up. And the effort of building them up needs to be incentivized, needs to be started, and linked to the talent development. A lot of the talent doesn't exist today. It'll have to be generated at the bridge, at the junction of different domains, agriculture and computer science, health and AI, and so on. So if we combine these efforts, then, we can have multiple advantages. It doesn't have to be data first, talent later, compute another time. So you can combine these in the context of capability development in a distributed way. So local data and AI ecosystems, local communities solving their own problems, they kind of add up. It's almost like one member of the advisory body describes this as, a million fireflies lighting up the sky. So that kind of an approach.
In the United States, we have a proposal called the National AI Research Resource. Now, the National AI Research Resource did receive tens of millions of dollars in funding by the Executive Order on AI that was signed on October 30th of last year. They have started this pilot. In order for us to launch the full National AI Research Resource, which would provide the computing power, data, and models available for these public interest applications, we would need congressional authority to allocate the billions of dollars. And that would come in the way of passing the Create AI Act. Now, I'm not holding my breath when I look at a Congress that cannot pass a budget to fund itself. But let's say if it was able to pass this and allocate the billions of dollars, still we have Sam Altman calling for at least $7 trillion for his next effort. So what I would actually propose, instead of us investing in public funds going to support this, we need more public-private collaboration. We already see that at the university, where many of our faculty and researchers are partnering with Amazon Web Services or Azure to do some of their computing. I think that there has to be a way for us to put more pressure on these companies, given their power, to provide their services available for public interest research applications at least a fair and reasonable rate.
Absolutely. This is what's been suggested after the interim report, that there should be a global fund of 10 billion with pooled funding across the public and the private sector. I just add one caveat. The experience of some of these existing initiatives is that they often end up subsidizing the private sector's compute resource. I think this has to be avoided, because we are talking about creating capabilities. It's not about subsidizing compute resource. So blending, yes, but subsidizing, perhaps not.
Great. Yeah, David, go ahead.
So I'm glad you asked this question, and I agree with the previous comments. The term democratizing AI has become a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. And that's because I was someone who came out early. June of last year, I wrote an op-ed in The Guardian saying that I didn't think it was responsible for Meta to release Llama, an open source, not really open source, large language model because of the way that they did it. They said it was a researcher access only tool, but it quickly got leaked, and it was accessible to anyone who wanted to use it. And it was not a heavily tested tool, and it was something that's kind of a dream tool for people running information operations to interfere in elections. And we know that's actively happening. And so often, and I've also, submitted something to this, Brandie and I were part of the submission to the NTIA public comment around dual use foundation models with widely available model weights. This is a public comment opportunity for people to give input on how the US government should think about regulating these. And that term dual use models with widely available model weights is a real mouthful. So I created an easy acronym for people to remember that. And it's dumb wham. And dumb wham you can remember because it's the sound of hitting your head on a computer keyboard. You can hit your head on anything. That's the wham. And then the dumb is how dumb an idea it is to give extremely powerful AI tools to anyone, anywhere, without really evaluating what they're going to do with it and how dangerous they are. So when I've expressed these views, I've been attacked, and I think it's safe to say attacked. I have some trolls on Twitter that come after me now, including the person who had Sam Altman's old job, the head of Y Combinator, trolled me and then blocked me on Twitter without us even engaging after reading an article that I wrote about this in IEEE Spectrum. And one thing that they've said is like, we have to democratize access to AI. It has to be open source. Well, democratize to me doesn't mean make sure that there can be 50 new billion-dollar unicorn startups coming out of Silicon Valley using open source to build their companies. I actually don't think that's democratization. I think you can democratize a lot of different parts of AI. You can democratize access to AI, which doesn't necessarily mean setting it free and giving it to anyone and everyone who might abuse it. You can still get the benefits of that openness by, for instance, requiring that any AI company give researcher access to their hardware and their software to vetted researchers at universities like this one who can demonstrate that they're doing good things with it and they have a good reason for it. So that's another version of democratization of access. I think there's also democratization of receipt of the benefits of AI. That's a different thing. And there's also democratization of the control of AI, which to me means democratizing the decision-making process about what we as a society determine to be acceptable or unacceptable uses of AI. And so I think anytime you hear the term democratize AI, I think it's really important to think, what part of AI exactly are we democratizing and who are we democratizing it for?
Great. Thank you. I had one last question I wanted to get to, but we're short on time. So would love to spend some time to open this up to the audience and have the panel answer any questions that people have. It's like I'm teaching MBAs again. I have to pick. Yeah, Nadia, why don't you go ahead?
I think I just want to thank you so much, by the way. It's hard to get through a lot of questions here. Okay, I want to go back to how you defined democratizing in sort of three ways. You mentioned get it vetted by researchers, we need to expand the access of benefits, and then talked about having a public conversation on what's acceptable, what's unacceptable. In the second part of what you said around receipt of the benefits, there was a guy named Shane Green, who worked on a concept called universal basic data income, where when we think about if there's a dollar value on a unit of data that these large language models use, like how do we think about that at the policy level and then separately? Yeah, I see you smiling, so I'm just so curious to hear your view around, do regulators have a role in governing the economic incentives of these AI models?
Very quickly, I love that question. The people who took the entire contents of the internet and stole our collective intellectual property and trained their AI systems on it absolutely owe us.
Anyone, Amandeep, did you want to quickly?
I think you made some important points, because democracy means, you have responsibilities as well. So I think this is about responsible democratization of access, of enabling. And I think open source versus closed, that's really a very simplistic conversation, because there are degrees of openness, and open source has a history of putting in place some regulations, some requirements, in terms of licensing arrangements, follow-up, etc. So we can improve on those in this context. And you have, some of these open source models, millions of people have downloaded them, coders from around the world, they are using them. So I think we should keep an eye on what are the risks and what are the marginal risks in terms of open source use. But as if we take this away, then I think we have a problem, and that problem is going to be concentration of tech power. There are some original sins in Web 1.0, Web 2.0. One was reliance on the ad model. And then, addictive apps, some of which are in the hands of children. And then, you could have military uses. So there are many other potential original sins out there. So we need kind of some expansion of the innovation space as well. We are in the early part of this. The engineering is racing ahead. The science is behind. So the innovation space needs to be more inclusive. That's to guard the public interest. So I think a responsible role for the open source community is important, as it has been earlier, with guardrails.
I just to keep it moving, just because we're very nearly out of time.
We are, but I can't help myself.
Okay,
because
just a couple of seconds.
if we go after data scraping, you are affecting public interest research. A lot of our research happens right now because we are able to scrape public data, and that does not violate the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Yes, while all of us have put content on the internet, like your Instagram thirst traps, like you put that out there, but guess what? You put it out there, and it's out there now, and everybody can pull it down. Like, we cannot go against scraping, because it is so important for us for research. The platforms and their application programming interfaces, their APIs, they're blocking our access all the time. So we don't even know what's happening on the platforms anymore. So the ability for us to scrape that data and not violate the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is so important for us to be able to understand what's happening on the platforms and hold them accountable.
Thanks. All right, let's do one last question that can be answered quickly, if people can sort of filter their questions in that way. Yes, let's go over here.
I don't know how this works, but I can talk about that. I was just thinking about, how do you see the regulations or sanctions for violating these regulations to be enforced or upheld? Because, we can have an upstream approach with regulating those who create the AI, or we can have a downstream approach with sanctioning those who use, for example, a kid at school using ChatGPT, or someone who uses generative AI for pornography. Because do you think it will be the most harmful technologies will be with a warning sign, just as packages of cigarettes have pictures of them, or do you think it will be more upstream with industries having regulations, for example, limiting the access of AI?
So definitely there need to be certain standards, and I'll have one of you talk more about the enforcement part, but definitely to go back to those the incentives that you also mentioned, and not just going, okay, this is what we enforce, because then it turns into what are the chances that this gets enforced, rather than, there is an incentive to do better. And to go back to that expansion of the innovation space, innovating business models that have those incentives to actually do better and not just calculate, what is the risk that someone will come after me, is extremely important. And right now, really, really difficult to figure out, okay, what can we actually do there? So I would love to see more innovation in that.
Well, this is my area of expertise, right? So who's liable? It's right now, the predominant law in the land is the EU AI Act. It's the most comprehensive piece of AI-related legislation in the world, and they have written that the developers must put in place due diligence to mitigate these harmful impacts. Now, a secondary user who builds upon that foundation model and does something terrible and awful with it, they are also liable.
I just wanted to add to that I think same, like it depends on the case and it's probably both. For instance, there was an investigative journalist who recently did a audit of ChatGPT ranking resumes and found really big disparate impacts. But there, I think it's really on the person who picked ChatGPT as a resume sorter. It's really weird. Why would you do that? So I think it's a combination of like, what is the harm, where is it, and whose obligation is it? But probably a combination of all of those is where the liability is.
Let David quickly weigh in here, and then we'll kind of wrap up.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a great question. What I'm hoping is that Amandeep is successful and we have an international body that regulates in a meaningful way AI. I'm hedging, and I have a second plan, which is I've gone to Brussels twice in the last 8 months, and today I was actually in Sacramento with two of the lead authors of the EU AI Act. That were there visiting with California lawmakers, and I actually, so my hedge is the combination California effect and Brussels effect, which is where two really important jurisdictions make some laws that are really important because a lot of key customers and key companies that are engaged in this are in those two places or want to do business in those places, and that's the way forward. And another interesting thing, just say, stay tuned for the EU AI liability directive. That's what comes next after the AI Act. They had to wait to pass the AI Act to start the deep work on that, and that's going to take about 3 years. But that's designed to really address the liability question meaningfully, and might be the first place in the world that does a really solid job of that.
Please add the New York effect to that.
Yes, I really hope the New York effect. Yeah, exactly. California effect, Brussels effect, New York effect. We'll get it done.
Sacramento, the Brussels of California. All right. Well, we'd love to thank you so much all for such an insightful and energizing conversation. Before we wrap up, I'd like to thank a few people on behalf of Haas. First, I'd like to thank Carrie Holtz, Meg Fellner, and Sarah Botker for their help planning this event, and also everyone at Haas facilities and the IT team for helping with the on-site logistics. I'd also like to thank Sudheer Gupta for all of his help organizing this event. This truly would not have happened without Sudheer. Also, once again, thank you to all of these amazing panelists for joining us this evening. And finally, we'd like to thank once again Dr. Amandeep Gill and the rest of the UN team, Lucia, for joining us here this evening. It's been an immense pleasure and honor. So thank you, everyone. And, thank you. Thanks.
It's the white. Oh. It's the white that touches it, not the silver. Oh, you get it to go on and on. Yeah.